Sometimes the moment that changes a war begins with something small, like a human tightening a single bolt. The wind howled across the red plains of Velkar IV, carrying dust that glittered like powdered glass beneath the pale twin suns. Ethan Carter knelt in the shadow of a shattered dropship, his gloved hands steady despite the cold bite of metal under his fingers. The battlefield had gone strangely quiet, the kind of silence that came only after machines stopped roaring and soldiers stopped shouting. His suit scanner blinked weakly at his wrist, showing fractured signals across the valley, but Ethan ignored it. Right now his attention was fixed on the armored figure lying against a jagged slab of black stone nearly 6 feet in front of him. The alien queen watched him without blinking. Even seated, she was imposing, easily a head taller than him, her luminous blue skin faintly glowing through the seams of her damaged armor. Plates of dark iridium alloy curved across her shoulders and torso, elegant and deadly at the same time. But one section near her ribs had split open where an energy surge had warped the locking ring. Ethan leaned closer, carefully adjusting the multi-tool in his hand. Sparks flickered as he sealed the damaged latch. "Hold still," he muttered. The queen's golden eyes narrowed. A long, spear-like blade rested lightly against the side of Ethan's neck, its humming edge hovering less than an inch from his collar seal. The weapon hadn't moved since he started working. "You understand," she said slowly, her voice deep and calm through the translator, "that I could end you before your next breath, human." Ethan shrugged slightly without looking up. "Yeah," he said, "but if I mess up this bracket, that armor plate will collapse inward the next time you move your arm. So maybe give me 2 more minutes." The blade did not press closer. The wind pushed another sheet of dust across the broken valley floor, rattling against the dropship hull like dry rain. Ethan tightened one last bolt and gently shifted the fractured plate back into alignment. The metal clicked into place with a smooth mechanical sound that felt strangely satisfying in the quiet. He wiped a smear of red dust off the surface with the sleeve of his flight suit. "There," he said. "Try moving your shoulder." The queen slowly lifted her arm. The armor rotated smoothly along its joint track. No grinding. No resistance. Her eyes flickered with something unexpected. She studied his hands, the careful way he had handled the repair, the way he had avoided even the smallest unnecessary movement near her injury. The blade lowered slightly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then the alien queen tilted her head, watching him with new curiosity, and murmured in a voice almost thoughtful, "Too gentle, human." Ethan finally glanced up at her. Behind the calm expression in her golden eyes, something had shifted. And somewhere beyond the distant ridges of Velkar IV, the faint roar of incoming engines was beginning to echo across the sky. The wind shifted across the valley, colder now, carrying the distant echo of engines somewhere beyond the low mountains. Ethan Carter noticed it immediately. Years of working on remote frontiers had taught him to listen to the air the same way other people listened to voices. Machines always announced themselves long before they appeared. He tightened the final clamp on the alien queen's armor and leaned back slightly, flexing his fingers after the delicate repair. The metal still radiated a faint warmth from the welding tool, and the smell of heated alloy mixed with the dry mineral scent of the red desert. Queen Kalira rotated her shoulder again, slowly this time, testing the repaired plate. The iridium segments slid over one another with the smooth mechanical grace they were clearly designed for. No grinding. No misalignment. The repair held perfectly. Her golden eyes studied Ethan in silence. It was not the look of a ruler examining a servant, and it was not the look of an enemy measuring a threat. It was curiosity, sharp and deliberate. "Your people wage war against mine," she said after a moment, her translator shaping each word with calm precision. "Yet you repair the armor of the one who commands the fleets that oppose you." Ethan wiped a streak of dust from his multi-tool and clipped it back onto his belt. "You were about to bleed out through a cracked pressure seal," he said simply. "War does not mean I stop being a mechanic." The queen considered that answer. The wind lifted strands of copper-colored dust and carried them across the broken hull of the dropship behind them. Far above, thin clouds drifted across the pale sky like slow-moving smoke. Kalira lowered the long blade that had been hovering near Ethan's neck and deactivated it with a quiet pulse of blue light. The weapon folded back into its staff housing with a soft mechanical click. Among my people, she said thoughtfully, a warrior proves strength by enduring pain without aid. Assistance during battle is considered weakness. Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Where I come from, he replied. Strength usually means making sure the person next to you survives the fight. Kalira tilted her head slightly, as if examining a puzzle that had suddenly gained a new piece. Her gaze moved from Ethan's face to his hands again. His gloves were scuffed and stained from years of repairs, but the movements that had fixed her armor had been careful, almost patient. Not the hands of someone who enjoyed destruction. The faint rumble in the distance grew a little louder now, low and steady, like thunder rolling beneath the mountains. Ethan heard it too. His eyes shifted briefly toward the horizon, where the valley narrowed into a line of black stone ridges. You hear that? He asked quietly. Kalira listened for several seconds. The muscles along her shoulders stiffened slightly beneath the repaired armor. Yes, she said. Those are Imperial patrol engines. Ethan nodded once. Then you probably have friends looking for you. They will not consider you a friend, she replied. Ethan looked back at her, calm and unbothered. That is usually how these things go. For a long moment, the alien queen simply watched him, the wind tugging lightly at the dark fabric of his flight suit. Something in her expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. The curiosity had deepened into something closer to respect. Human, Kalira said slowly, almost as if testing the word again. Why did you not leave when you had the chance? Ethan glanced once more toward the distant mountains where the growing sound of approaching engines vibrated faintly through the air. Then he looked back at the queen whose armor he had just repaired and shrugged. Because, he said quietly, someone had to make sure that plates stayed in place. The sound of engines grew stronger across the Red Valley, no longer distant thunder, but a steady vibration in the air that hummed through the broken hull of the dropship. Ethan Carter lifted his eyes toward the horizon where the black mountain ridges cut across the pale sky like the teeth of a giant saw. Thin trails of dust began to drift along the ridge line as the wind shifted again. Machines were coming fast. He rested his hands on his knees and slowly stood up, brushing the red powder from his gloves. The ground beneath his boots felt warm from the long day beneath the twin suns, but the air had begun to cool as evening approached. Velkar IV always changed quickly when the light began to fall. Queen Kalira rose to her full height beside him. Even with the repaired armor plate newly sealed along her side, she carried herself with effortless balance, the polished metal segments sliding quietly over one another as she straightened. For a moment, she rolled her shoulder again, as if confirming the repair for the third time. The armor moved flawlessly. Her golden eyes shifted toward Ethan with a thoughtful expression that had replaced the earlier suspicion. Your repair is precise, she said calmly. My engineers require specialized instruments to restore armor joints this cleanly. Ethan gave a small shrug. Out here you learn to fix things with whatever you have, he replied. Ships, tools, sometimes people. The queen studied his face as if measuring the meaning behind that answer. The wind carried another pulse of engine noise across the valley, stronger now, echoing faintly against the stone ridges. Kalira turned her head toward the sound. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. 3 craft, she said after several seconds. Fast patrol ships. Ethan nodded once. That matches the sound. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The desert stretched silent around them except for the growing mechanical hum approaching from miles away. Broken fragments of the dropship glinted faintly under the fading sunlight. Ethan walked a few steps toward the ridge line and looked across the valley floor. His suit scanner flickered weakly but managed to confirm the movement. 3 small signals closing quickly. He exhaled slowly. They will be here in about 5 minutes, he said. Kalira stepped beside him. The alien queen was tall enough that the wind pulled gently at the crest of silver fabric attached to the back of her armor. Her gaze followed his toward the distant horizon. If they find you standing beside me, she said quietly, they will assume you captured me. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I figured that part out. You should leave, she continued. Your transport wreckage provides enough debris to conceal your path across the lower ridge. If you depart now you may reach the canyon before the patrol arrives. Ethan glanced back toward the damaged dropship where pieces of scorched hull plating leaned against the stone. The valley floor beyond it stretched empty for miles. There was nowhere else to hide. Then he looked back at the queen. "You would tell your soldiers that I escaped?" he asked. Kalira held his gaze. The faint glow beneath her blue skin shimmered slightly as the light of the setting suns shifted across the desert. "I would tell them the truth," she said. Ethan raised one eyebrow. "Which version of the truth is that?" For a moment the queen said nothing. Her golden eyes moved once more to the repaired armor plate along her side, where the seam now held perfectly. She touched the edge of the metal briefly with 2 fingers. Then she looked back at him. "That a human engineer repaired the armor of his enemy," she said quietly, "and chose to remain." Ethan looked out across the valley again, where the distant patrol ships were beginning to cast faint shadows against the clouds. He folded his arms and leaned lightly against the warm hull of the broken dropship. "Well," he said calmly, "I guess we will see how they feel about that." The hum of approaching patrol ships deepened until it rolled across the valley floor like distant thunder that refused to fade. Ethan Carter remained leaning against the fractured hull of the dropship, arms loosely folded, watching the sky where the light from the twin suns had begun to soften into long amber shadows. The red desert stretched wide and quiet around them, but the air now carried a steady vibration that grew stronger with every passing second. Machines always arrived before the dust settled on a battlefield, and today would be no different. Queen Kalira stood several feet away, her tall frame outlined against the glowing horizon. The repaired armor along her side reflected a faint ribbon of sunlight as she slowly rotated her shoulder again, testing the movement with careful precision. The plate held firm. The seam Ethan had sealed earlier remained perfectly aligned. She noticed his eyes briefly tracking the motion and spoke without looking at him. "You take pride in your craft," she said calmly. Ethan shrugged. "When something works after you fix it, that is usually a good sign." The alien queen allowed the faintest hint of amusement to touch her expression, though it faded quickly as the engine noise overhead grew louder. A shadow crossed the clouds far above, small but unmistakable. One patrol craft had reached the outer edge of the valley. The second and third followed close behind. Ethan straightened slightly from the hull and squinted upward. The ships were still several miles away, but their engine trails carved thin silver lines across the sky. 3 minutes now," he said quietly. Kalira stepped forward beside him. Her gaze followed the distant aircraft as they angled toward the valley entrance. The wind tugged gently at the trailing edge of the ceremonial fabric attached to the back of her armor, but her stance remained perfectly balanced, calm, and deliberate. "My patrol captains are efficient," she said. "They will secure this area quickly." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, I figured they would." He glanced down at the desert floor, studying the scattered debris from the destroyed dropship. A bent panel of alloy lay half buried in the dust several yards away. A cracked fuel container reflected the fading sunlight like a broken mirror. There were no working systems left, no engines, no transport options. Just the 2 of them standing quietly as the patrol ships approached. Kalira observed his careful scan of the surroundings and seemed to understand his conclusion. "You could still run," she said. Ethan shook his head. "Across 5 miles of open desert with 3 aircraft overhead? That would be a short trip." The queen looked back at him. The golden color of her eyes reflected the dying light of the sun, as if small flames lived behind them. "Most warriors would still attempt it," she said. "Most warriors are not mechanics," Ethan replied. Another rumble passed overhead as the first patrol ship descended lower through the clouds. Its engines emitted a controlled, steady tone designed for rapid deployment rather than intimidation. The second and third ships adjusted their course to flank the valley entrance. Ethan exhaled slowly and rested his hands on his belt. "Looks like your friends are about to arrive." Kalira did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied the repaired armor plate. One last time, tracing the edge of the metal seam with the tip of one finger. The repair had been precise, almost delicate, not the work of someone acting out of fear. She lowered her hand and turned toward Ethan again. "Human," she said slowly, "do you regret staying?" Ethan looked out across the desert where the patrol ships now descended through the final layer of clouds, their landing lights glowing faintly against the red landscape. He considered the question for a moment. Then he gave a small, calm shake of his head. "No," he said simply. Above them, the first patrol ship crossed the ridge line and began its descent toward the valley floor. The first patrol ship descended through the amber clouds with controlled precision, its engines humming like distant thunder rolling slowly across the valley floor. Ethan Carter watched it approach without moving, his eyes following the craft as it lowered itself above the ridge line and began circling the broken dropship. Dust lifted from the desert beneath the downward push of the engine wash, swirling across the red ground in slow spirals. The second ship followed moments later, positioning itself several hundred yards away near the edge of the valley. The third craft hovered farther back, maintaining a careful perimeter as if forming a silent triangle around the scene below. Ethan slipped his hands into the side pockets of his flight suit and shifted his weight slightly against the hull behind him. The warm metal from the damaged dropship still radiated the heat it had absorbed all afternoon beneath the twin suns. Beside him, Queen Kalira remained completely still. The polished plates of her armor caught the fading sunlight, reflecting thin ribbons of gold across the desert floor. The repair along her side remained flawless, the seam almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. For a brief moment her eyes moved down to that precise line of metal again, studying the place where the human mechanic had quietly restored her armor in the middle of a battlefield. The first patrol ship completed its slow circle and began descending toward the open space roughly 50 yards away from the wreckage. Its landing gear extended with smooth mechanical grace. The engine noise softened slightly as the craft reduced power. Ethan tilted his head a little as he watched. "Nice landing," he said quietly. Kalira glanced at him. "Captain Varen commands that vessel," she replied. "He prides himself on precise maneuvering." Ethan nodded once. "Seems like he earned that reputation." The ship touched down gently on the red sand, sending a low ripple of dust outward in a wide ring. The second craft settled moments later on the opposite side of the valley floor, while the third remained hovering above like a silent guardian. The engine hum gradually lowered to a steady idle. For a few seconds nothing happened. The valley returned to an almost unnatural quiet, broken only by the soft whisper of wind moving across the open desert. Ethan studied the landing ship carefully. The side hatch had not opened yet. Whoever was inside was observing first. Kalira folded her arms lightly behind her back, adopting the composed posture of a ruler awaiting her escort rather than a survivor of a crashed battlefield. "They will approach cautiously," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Good habit." A faint mechanical click sounded from the patrol ship as the side hatch finally began to open. A ramp extended slowly toward the ground. Shapes moved within the dim interior lighting of the craft, silhouettes preparing to step out onto the desert floor. Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose and straightened his shoulders. He could feel the moment changing around him, the quiet pause before explanations would begin. Kalira stepped forward half a pace, her gaze fixed calmly on the approaching figures emerging from the patrol vessel. Then she spoke softly, almost as if reminding herself of something she had just realized. "You remained," she said. Ethan glanced sideways at her. "Yeah," he answered simply. The alien queen's golden eyes flickered once more toward the repaired plate along her armor before returning to the figures descending the ramp. The patrol captain had arrived, and the valley was no longer empty. The figures descending the ramp moved with quiet discipline, their armored forms outlined by the interior lights of the patrol ship. Ethan Carter watched them approach across the red sand, counting their steps without thinking about it. For officers, and one taller figure walking in the center. That one had to be the captain. The wind carried the low hum of the idle engines across the valley while the two other patrol ships remained positioned like silent sentinels along the ridge line. The desert sky had deepened into a soft copper color as the twin suns drifted closer to the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the ground, turning the broken remains of the dropship into jagged shapes of black against the red dust. Queen Kalira stepped forward slightly, her posture calm and composed as the approaching group came within 30 yards. The lead officer halted immediately and lowered his head in a formal gesture of respect. "Your Majesty," he said through the thin distortion of his helmet transmitter. The others behind him mirrored the motion. Ethan remained where he stood beside the hull, arms relaxed at his sides, watching the exchange with quiet interest. The captain stepped forward next. His armor was darker than the others, marked with thin silver lines that caught the last light of the evening sun. He removed his helmet slowly and tucked it beneath his arm, revealing sharp features and pale silver eyes that moved immediately from the queen to the human standing several feet away. For a moment the captain said nothing. The wind shifted again, stirring the dust between them. Then he spoke carefully. "We detected the distress signal from your armor beacon," he said to Kalira. "We arrived as quickly as possible." The queen nodded once. "Your response time was acceptable, Captain Varen." The captain inclined his head again, but his gaze did not leave Ethan. The curiosity in his expression sharpened slightly, like a man trying to solve a puzzle that did not quite make sense. "May I ask," Varen continued slowly, "why a human engineer is standing beside you in the center of a battlefield?" Ethan gave a small half-smile and scratched lightly at the side of his neck. "That is a fair question," he said. Kalira raised one hand before the captain could continue speaking. The motion was small but carried absolute authority. The patrol officers behind Varen immediately straightened and stepped back half a pace. The queen's golden eyes moved briefly toward Ethan and then returned to her captain. "The human did not capture me," she said calmly. "Nor did he attempt to harm me." Captain Varen's brow tightened slightly. "Then why did he remain here after the crash?" For a moment Kalira did not answer. Instead she turned her body slightly, so the fading light of the suns caught the repaired plate along her side. The metal seam gleamed faintly where Ethan's careful work had sealed it. Earlier, her fingers brushed the edge of the armor once before she spoke. "Because," she said quietly, "the human repaired my armor when it failed." The captain's eyes flicked instantly to the seam along the queen's side. His expression changed in a way Ethan recognized immediately. Surprise first, then calculation. The other officers exchanged quick glances as if confirming they had heard correctly. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing. The wind moved through the valley again, lifting thin waves of red dust across the ground. Captain Varen studied the repaired armor for several seconds before finally speaking again. "A human mechanic repaired the armor of the Queen of the Empire," he said slowly. Kalira nodded once. "Yes." The captain's silver eyes returned to Ethan Carter. For the first time since stepping off the ship, his voice carried genuine curiosity. "Human," he said carefully, "why would you do such a thing?" Ethan looked from the captain to the repaired armor plate, and then back again. The answer came easily. "Because it was broken," he said. Captain Varen held Ethan Carter's gaze for several seconds after the human finished speaking. The answer hung in the quiet desert air like something unexpectedly simple that refused to become more complicated. "Because it was broken." The wind swept another thin wave of red dust across the valley floor, sliding past the boots of the assembled officers and curling around the fractured hull of the dropship behind Ethan. For a moment, none of the patrol soldiers spoke. Their attention shifted between the Queen's repaired armor and the human engineer standing calmly beside the wreckage. Varen slowly folded his helmet beneath his arm and stepped a little closer, studying the repair along Kalira's side with the careful eye of someone who understood machines. The seam was clean, the locking ring perfectly aligned with the surrounding plates. It looked like the work of a trained armor technician rather than an improvised battlefield patch. "You performed this repair with basic tools," the captain said thoughtfully. Ethan nodded once. "A multi-tool and a portable weld torch." Varen glanced briefly toward the destroyed dropship. "Those were salvaged from the wreckage?" "Most of them," Ethan replied. "You would be surprised how many useful tools survive a crash." A faint ripple of quiet amusement moved through two of the patrol officers standing behind the captain, though they quickly regained their composure. Kalira watched the exchange without interrupting. Her golden eyes followed Varen as he circled slightly to examine the repaired armor plate more closely. The fading light from the twin suns glimmered along the polished surface, highlighting the exact line where Ethan's careful work had sealed the damaged joint. Varen finally straightened and faced the Queen again. "The repair will hold for several hours at least," he said. "Perhaps longer." Kalira inclined her head slightly. "That was the intention." The captain looked once more toward Ethan Carter, studying him with new interest. The human stood relaxed beside the hull of the wrecked ship, one boot resting lightly against a piece of fallen alloy plating. There was no tension in his posture, no sign that he considered himself surrounded by enemy soldiers. It was simply a man waiting for the next step in a conversation. Varen seemed to notice that detail as well. You understood who she was, the captain said. It was not exactly a question. Ethan nodded again. Yeah, I figured that part out. Yet you still repaired the armor of a queen who commands fleets that oppose your people. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward the repaired seam again. The metal reflected the last orange rays of sunlight as evening settled across the valley. Look, he said calmly. A broken mechanism does not care who you are fighting. It just needs to be fixed before it fails completely. Varen's expression tightened slightly as he considered that answer. The officers behind him exchanged another quick glance. Kalira stepped forward one pace then, her voice quiet, but carrying easily across the open desert. Captain Varen. The patrol leader immediately straightened. Your Majesty. The Queen gestured briefly toward Ethan. This human mechanic demonstrated something rare today. Varen's eyes moved toward her again. What is that, Your Majesty? Kalira turned her gaze to Ethan Carter, studying him with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown earlier beside the wreckage. Restraint, she said. The wind moved through the valley again as the final edge of the sun dipped toward the horizon, leaving the repaired armor plate gleaming softly in the fading light, while the patrol officers quietly absorbed the meaning behind their queen's words. The word restraint settled over the valley like the quiet that follows a storm. Captain Varen did not respond immediately. His silver eyes shifted once more from Queen Kalira to the human engineer standing beside the broken dropship. The last light of the twin suns painted the desert in long shadows and deep copper colors, turning the dust in the air into drifting ribbons of gold. Ethan Carter remained exactly where he had been, calm and still, as if standing in front of a squad of unfamiliar soldiers was nothing more unusual than waiting for a delayed transport. Varen slowly walked a few steps closer, his boots pressing shallow marks into the fine red sand. The patrol officers behind him stayed where they were, their attention fixed on the exchange unfolding in front of them. Restraint, the captain repeated thoughtfully. That is not a word our historians often associate with humans. Kalira did not look away from Ethan. Historians observe wars, she replied quietly. They do not always observe moments between battles. The wind shifted again across the valley floor, carrying the faint smell of heated metal from the wreckage of the dropship. Somewhere above them, the third patrol craft adjusted its hovering position, its engines producing a soft vibration that rippled through the still evening air. Varen finally turned his attention fully toward Ethan Carter. Human, he said carefully. When you approached the Queen, you were armed. Ethan nodded. Standard field sidearm. Yet you chose to repair damaged armor instead of using the advantage you had. Ethan gave a small shrug. That plate was failing under stress. If it collapsed, the joint beneath it would lock completely. You would have had a much bigger problem. Varen's brow tightened slightly. You speak of armor mechanics as if the identity of the wearer is irrelevant. Ethan glanced toward the repaired seam along Kalira's side. The polished metal still reflected the fading light of the sunset. Most machines do not care about politics, he said simply. For a moment the captain studied him in silence. The officers behind him remained perfectly still, their armor catching the soft glow of the patrol ship's landing lights. Kalira finally shifted her stance slightly, the repaired plate moving smoothly with the motion of her shoulder. The joint performed flawlessly, just as Ethan had predicted. Captain, she said quietly, this human mechanic could have exploited my vulnerability when the armor failed. Varen inclined his head. Yes, Your Majesty. Instead, Kalira continued. He restored the mechanism that protected me. The captain looked once again at the thin seam where the repair had been made. It was clean, efficient, almost elegant in its simplicity. A battlefield solution created with patience rather than aggression. Varen exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the unusual logic of the moment. The desert wind moved gently through the valley again, lifting thin spirals of red dust around their feet. Finally, the captain straightened his posture and addressed Ethan Carter once more. Human, he said, you have created a situation that our command structure did not anticipate. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. I do that sometimes. The faintest trace of a smile touched the edge of Captain Varen's expression before disappearing again beneath his disciplined composure. Behind him, the patrol officers exchanged another brief glance. Kalira stepped forward half a pace, the light from the patrol ship illuminating the repaired armor plate clearly now. She turned slightly toward her captain and spoke in the calm voice of someone making a decision that would carry consequences beyond the quiet valley. "Captain Varen," she said, "prepare a seat aboard your vessel." The captain looked surprised for only a fraction of a second. "For the human?" Kalira's golden eyes flickered once more toward Ethan Carter. "Yes," she replied calmly. "For the human mechanic who chose restraint when he held power." For a moment, the valley became completely still again, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Captain Varen did not move. His silver eyes remained fixed on Queen Kalira while the words she had spoken slowly settled into meaning. "Prepare a seat aboard your vessel." For the human. The patrol officers behind him shifted slightly, exchanging quiet glances that revealed their surprise even through the discipline of their posture. A human mechanic boarding an Imperial patrol craft was not a scenario that appeared in any standard protocol manual. Ethan Carter looked from the Queen to the captain and then up toward the patrol ship resting 50 yards away on the red desert floor. The vessel's landing lights glowed softly now as the sun slipped lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the broken valley. He scratched lightly at the side of his jaw and gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Well," he said calmly, "that is new." Captain Varen finally exhaled and straightened his posture. The moment of hesitation passed quickly as years of command training returned to the surface. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "transporting a human aboard an Imperial patrol vessel will raise questions." Kalira's expression remained composed. "Questions often lead to understanding, Captain." Varen considered that answer for several seconds. His gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan Carter again, measuring the man who stood beside the wreckage of a destroyed ship with no visible concern about the unfamiliar soldiers surrounding him. The human's calm presence was beginning to feel less like arrogance and more like quiet confidence. "Very well," the captain said at last. He turned slightly toward the officers behind him. "Prepare the auxiliary passenger compartment." One of the patrol officers nodded immediately and moved back toward the landing ramp of the patrol ship, his boots leaving sharp prints in the red sand as he walked. The others remained where they were, though their attention had shifted entirely toward the human engineer now. Ethan watched the officer head back toward the ship and then glanced sideways at Kalira. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. The Queen turned her head toward him. The fading sunlight caught the smooth curve of the repaired armor plate along her side, reflecting a thin line of gold where the metal seam held perfectly. "You demonstrated restraint when you possessed advantage," she replied. "That deserves acknowledgement." Ethan folded his arms loosely and looked back toward the patrol ship. "Most people where I come from would call that basic decency." Kalira studied him for a moment, as if examining a concept that had not appeared often in her experience of war. "Basic decency," she repeated softly, testing the phrase with quiet curiosity. The captain approached again after issuing his orders, stopping a few feet from Ethan Carter. The tension in his posture had eased slightly now, though his eyes remained alert. "Human," Varen said, "you will remain under observation during transport." Ethan nodded. "That seems fair." The captain studied him once more, perhaps expecting hesitation that never appeared. Finally, he gestured toward the patrol ship waiting in the evening light. "Then you may board." Ethan pushed himself away from the hull of the wrecked dropship and brushed the dust from his flight suit. The wind moved across the valley again as the final edge of the sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the repaired armor plate on the alien Queen's side shining softly under the artificial glow of the patrol ship's lights, while the human mechanic began walking beside the soldiers toward the waiting vessel. The ramp of the patrol ship extended fully with a soft mechanical hum, settling onto the red desert sand as the last light of Velkar IV faded behind the distant mountains. Ethan Carter walked beside the patrol officers without hesitation, his boots leaving calm, even prints across the dust, as if he had boarded unfamiliar ships his entire life. Behind him the wrecked dropship rested in silence, its shattered hull now nothing more than a dark shape against the deepening twilight. Queen Kalira followed several steps behind, her posture tall and composed as the patrol lights illuminated the valley floor in pale white beams. The repaired armor plate along her side reflected the artificial light, the thin seam Ethan had welded earlier still holding perfectly smooth. Captain Varen walked slightly ahead, guiding the small group toward the open ramp. The patrol officers maintained their disciplined formation, though their attention occasionally drifted toward the human engineer walking calmly among them. The interior of the vessel glowed with cool silver lighting as Ethan stepped onto the ramp. The metal surface vibrated faintly beneath his boots, carrying the quiet pulse of the ship's idling engines. He glanced once over his shoulder toward the valley they were leaving behind. The red desert stretched wide beneath the rising stars, empty again except for the broken shape of the crashed ship. "You know," Ethan said thoughtfully as he continued walking, "this is not how I expected today to end." Captain Varen glanced back briefly. "How did you expect it to end?" Ethan considered that question for a moment. "Usually when my ship crashes, I spend the evening trying to fix the engine." The captain allowed the faintest hint of a smile before turning forward again. Inside the patrol vessel, the atmosphere felt calm and controlled, every surface polished, and every system quietly humming with precise efficiency. An officer waiting near the entry corridor stepped aside respectfully as Queen Kalira boarded behind the group. The patrol crew immediately straightened at her presence, lowering their heads in silent acknowledgement. Ethan noticed the gesture and gave a small nod of appreciation. "Good crew," he murmured quietly. Varen responded without slowing his pace. "They are disciplined." The corridor ahead opened into a small auxiliary passenger chamber where a single seat had been prepared near the observation window. The transparent panel revealed the valley. Outside where the remaining patrol ships hovered above the desert floor like silent guardians. Ethan stepped inside and paused beside the seat, studying the design of the interior with quiet curiosity. "Comfortable transport," he said. Captain Varen stopped near the doorway and folded his hands behind his back. "You will remain here until we reach the command vessel." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Command vessel?" Before the captain could respond, Queen Kalira entered the chamber. The room seemed to grow still as she stepped forward, her golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the control lights. She looked toward the observation window where the red valley slowly darkened beneath the evening sky. "The Imperial fleet is currently stationed above this system," she said calmly. Ethan looked out through the window again, imagining the massive ships orbiting far beyond the atmosphere. "That sounds like a lot of attention for one mechanic," he said. Kalira turned toward him slightly, the repaired armor plate along her side, catching the light once more. "You repaired the armor of a queen during a battle," she replied. "That tends to attract attention." Ethan rested one hand lightly on the back of the passenger seat and gave a quiet, thoughtful nod. Outside the observation window, the patrol ship's engines slowly began to rise in pitch, signaling that the craft was preparing to leave the desert valley behind. The patrol ship lifted from the red desert with smooth, controlled power, the vibration of its engines traveling gently through the deck beneath Ethan Carter's boots. Outside the observation window, the valley slowly fell away, shrinking into a patchwork of shadows and crimson dust as the vessel climbed toward the upper atmosphere. Ethan rested one hand against the back of the passenger seat and watched the landscape fade beneath them. The broken dropship that had stranded him there only minutes earlier was now barely visible, a dark mark against the vast desert floor of Velkar IV. Inside the chamber, the lighting remained calm and steady, illuminating the polished interior panels of the patrol vessel. The quiet hum of advanced machinery filled the space like a steady heartbeat. Queen Kalira stood near the observation window beside him, her tall figure outlined by the stars beginning to appear in the sky beyond the atmosphere. The repaired armor plate along her side reflected the soft interior lighting, the thin seam Ethan had welded. Earlier still perfectly aligned as she shifted her shoulders slightly. Captain Varen remained near the doorway, maintaining a respectful distance while observing the two of them in thoughtful silence. As the ship continued its ascent, the sky outside deepened from copper twilight to a dark ocean of stars. Velkar IV slowly rotated beneath them, the red deserts now blending into shadow as the patrol vessel passed through the upper atmosphere and into orbit. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the observation panel, his eyes widening just a little as the full view of space revealed itself beyond the glass. Above the planet, stretching across the darkness like a silent constellation of steel, hung the Imperial fleet. Massive ships drifted in formation, their hulls reflecting distant starlight, while faint blue engine glows pulsed softly along their sterns. The scale of the fleet filled the sky beyond the window, dozens of vessels suspended in perfect alignment around the planet. Ethan let out a slow breath. That, he said quietly, is a lot of hardware. Captain Varen stepped forward slightly as the patrol vessel adjusted its trajectory toward one of the larger ships. The fleet is currently maintaining defensive orbit, he explained. Your arrival will not go unnoticed. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I figured as much. Queen Kalira watched the fleet with calm familiarity, her expression unreadable as the patrol craft moved steadily toward a massive command vessel positioned near the center of the formation. The ship dwarfed the others around it, its dark hull stretching nearly half a mile across with glowing docking ports lining its surface like distant stars. That vessel, Varen said, gesturing toward the enormous structure ahead, is the Imperial command carrier Resolute Horizon. Ethan studied the immense ship through the observation window, taking in the intricate structure of its armor plating and the slow movement of escort craft drifting around its perimeter. You run your empire from that? He asked. Kalira shook her head slightly. No, she replied calmly. But important decisions are made there. The patrol vessel continued its approach, gliding through the silent traffic lanes between the orbiting ships until the command carrier filled the entire view beyond the window. Docking lights flickered to life along one of the massive bays as the patrol ship received clearance to enter. Ethan folded his arms lightly and watched the docking corridor open ahead of them. You know, he said thoughtfully, most mechanics do not end their day by boarding a flagship. Captain Varen allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. Most mechanics do not repair the armor of an alien queen during a battlefield crash. The patrol vessel slipped smoothly into the illuminated docking bay of the command carrier, its engines lowering to a quiet whisper as the massive doors slowly closed behind them, while the human engineer prepared to step into the center of an empire that now wanted to understand him. The patrol vessel settled gently onto the vast docking deck of the command carrier Resolute Horizon, its engines lowering to a soft whisper as the interior lights of the bay flooded the observation window with a cool silver glow. Ethan Carter watched the enormous hangar expand across his view as the ship glided forward into its assigned berth. Rows of larger vessels rested along the massive docking structure like sleeping giants, their hulls reflecting the quiet activity of crew members moving across the deck far below. The scale of the carrier was difficult to comprehend even from inside the patrol ship. The bay ceiling arched nearly 300 feet overhead, layered with glowing maintenance rails and suspended docking cranes that moved with slow mechanical precision. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the observation window, studying the enormous structure with quiet fascination. That is not a ship, he said softly. That is a moving city. Captain Varen stood near the chamber doorway, his posture relaxed but attentive as the patrol vessel completed its docking sequence. The Resolute Horizon serves as command platform for 3 fleet divisions, he replied calmly. It houses more than 12,000 crew members. Ethan let out a low whistle under his breath. That is a lot of people who probably do not expect to see a mechanic from a crashed cargo ship walking through their halls. Queen Kalira remained composed beside him, her golden eyes focused on the docking platform where the patrol vessel had now come to a complete stop. The repaired armor plate along her side reflected the bright interior lights of the bay, the thin seams still flawless as she shifted her shoulders slightly. The mechanism moved smoothly without the slightest resistance. For a brief moment her fingers touched the edge of the metal again, as if confirming the work that had been done only an hour earlier on the desert floor. The patrol ship's ramp extended with a quiet mechanical sound as the interior hatch unlocked. Outside, a small escort unit had already assembled along the deck, their armor polished and their posture formal as they awaited the arrival of their queen. Ethan noticed the arrangement and raised an eyebrow slightly. Looks like a welcoming committee, he murmured. Captain Varen stepped forward and motioned toward the ramp. Your presence here is unusual, he said. But the Queen has ordered that you be received without hostility. Ethan nodded once. That is reassuring. The group moved toward the ramp together, the steady hum of the command carrier vibrating faintly through the deck beneath their feet. As Ethan stepped onto the docking platform, he immediately felt the difference in scale. The hangar stretched in every direction, a vast chamber of steel and light, filled with quiet motion as technicians, pilots, and officers carried out their duties beneath the towering hulls of imperial vessels. Several nearby crew members paused when they noticed the human walking beside the queen and her captain. Their expressions revealed brief surprise before discipline returned to their posture. Kilira continued forward without slowing, her calm presence guiding the escort group across the polished deck toward a central lift platform that would carry them deeper into the carrier's command levels. Ethan walked beside them with the same steady pace he had maintained since leaving the desert valley, though his eyes quietly studied the immense machinery surrounding them. When the lift platform rose and began carrying them upward through the massive interior of the carrier, Ethan glanced sideways at the queen. "So," he said thoughtfully, "what happens to the mechanic now?" Kilira turned her head slightly, the soft light of the carrier reflecting in her golden eyes. "Now," she replied calmly. "The Empire listens to the story of a human who chose restraint." The lift platform carried them upward through the towering interior of the command carrier Resolute Horizon, rising smoothly along a vertical corridor surrounded by layered decks of steel and light. Ethan Carter rested one hand lightly against the railing as he watched the enormous structure of the carrier unfold around them. Walkways stretched across open-air shafts hundreds of feet tall, where technicians moved along suspended maintenance tracks and transport drones glided quietly between docking bays. The low mechanical hum of the ship vibrated through the metal beneath his boots like the steady heartbeat of something far larger than any one crew member inside it. Queen Kilira stood beside him with the calm composure of someone entirely accustomed to the scale of such power. The repaired armor plate along her side reflected the pale lighting of the command levels as the lift ascended. The seam remained smooth and flawless, a simple repair made with basic tools that now traveled with her into the heart of an empire. Captain Varen remained just behind them, his attention shifting occasionally toward Ethan as if still trying to understand how the quiet mechanic from a crashed transport had become the focus of an imperial escort. The lift finally slowed and came to a silent stop at the command tier. The doors opened into a wide chamber lined with observation windows that revealed the star-filled void beyond the hull of the carrier. Officers moved quietly across the room, their voices calm and professional as tactical displays glowed along the walls. When Queen Kilira stepped forward, the entire chamber shifted instantly into formal silence. Every officer present straightened in respectful acknowledgement of her presence. Ethan noticed the reaction and gave a small thoughtful nod. "You definitely outrank me," he said quietly. Kilira allowed the faintest trace of amusement to touch her expression as she walked toward the center of the chamber. Captain Varen followed, while Ethan remained a step behind them, his eyes moving across the enormous holographic display suspended in the air above the command floor. The projection showed the orbit of Velkar IV and the formation of the Imperial fleet surrounding the planet like a silent shield. After a moment, Kilira turned toward the officers gathered around the command display. Her voice carried calmly across the chamber. "Today our fleet recovered me from a battlefield crash on the surface of Velkar IV," she said. During that time, an unexpected event occurred. The officers listened closely, their attention now shifting toward the human standing quietly beside the lift platform. Kilira gestured toward Ethan Carter. "This human mechanic repaired my armor when its structural joint failed during the crash." A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the command crew. Ethan shifted slightly, but remained relaxed under the sudden attention. Kilira continued, her golden eyes reflecting the light of the holographic display above them. "He did this while fully aware of who I was and what authority I carry." Captain Varen watched the reaction of the officers carefully as the realization settled across the room. Kilira turned slightly toward Ethan then, studying him with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown on the desert floor earlier that evening. "When a warrior holds power over another," she said calmly, "most choose advantage." Her gaze moved briefly to the repaired armor plate along her side before returning to the assembled command officers. "This human chose restraint." The chamber remained silent as the meaning of those words spread across the command deck of the carrier. Ethan Carter rested one hand casually on the railing of the lift platform and looked out through the observation window toward the distant stars beyond the fleet. For a moment, the massive empire surrounding him felt strangely quiet. Then Kilira spoke once more, her voice steady and thoughtful. Sometimes, she said, the strength of a species is revealed not in how it fights, but in the moment it chooses not to.